Well, hi everyone. Welcome. Today we're with one of our SAMMY clients, users, and we're very excited to be here today with Jason, who's gonna talk a little bit about his experience using SAMMY, and we're gonna have a little bit of a conversation, not only about SAMMY, of course, about OWASP SAMM, about wider application security and what generally are the best practices, and we're gonna take also a very unique angle on looking at it from also a insurance perspective and how it can actually help with, for example, reducing cyber insurance premiums. I'm very excited to have Jason here today. Obviously, I'm Nicholas. I'm a solutions engineer at Calific, and I'll get straight to it by just asking you, Jason, if you can just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your background and how you're and what you do at Signin Solutions, and also what Signin Solutions is about, of course.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks, Nicholas. My name is Jason Mordeno. I'm the Director of Compliance and Security, and also the Global Privacy and Data Protection Officer at Signin Solutions. And our company is a cloud SaaS. We specialize in visitor management and compliance risk and workflows and meeting and workspaces. My background in security is a conglomerate of multiple different hats. Essentially, I handle cybersecurity, security governance, compliance, GRC, governance, risk and compliance. And because we also deal business in Europe, I'm also the privacy and global and data protection officer. That's my current role at Signin Solutions. It's an interesting mix of global requirements.
Yeah, no, sounds very interesting, very hectic as well. A lot of different things going on at the same time. And yeah, okay, perfect. So let's get started a little bit onto Signin specifically. And I think my first question is to understand what you guys were doing before actually implementing OWASP SAMM and starting to use the SAMMY tool as well. So can you just walk me through like what the workflows around security, or what were you doing around security before you decided to start implementing OWASP SAMM?
Yeah, sounds good. So for us, we're a ISO 27001 and SOC 2 Type 2 compliance shop. And the reason we pivoted eventually towards OWASP SAMM, the framework itself, and Codific SAMMY, is we basically found the current practices insufficient against our customer contractual obligations, against what we're doing. And also, we are a risk management company when it comes to our products. We help manage our customers' risk. So for us, we had to take a deep dive into application security. So typically, we had software development lifecycle. It's enhanced through like security practices, and then we leverage OWASP SAMM top 10. But for us, it's not sufficient enough because when you have a shifting and changing culture, effectively some of these safeguards can easily become a tick box. And for us, how do we make our actual practices what we say we do, right? That's the big part. And also, how do we make it resilient against changes in the business, changes in the industry, and just changes in general? And the second part of that is we also had to make it simple for our developers, right? Because if you have requirements in security, it could appear as overbearing or something that slows them down. So for us, we had to find a creative way or a way to elicit, stronger cybersecurity requirements without suffocating our developers. Because otherwise, it seems like here's another list of requirements you have to do or else. So our intent of moving towards OWASP SAMM is make it more what we call scientific or towards that, and make it easier for a developer that this is not simply in their framework or thought process. This is a gradual uplift towards application security and making sure we have our guardrails. And the reason we went with Codific SAMMY because it was one that was easy to digest, easy for our developers to participate in, and easy for us to just scale up to. And I would recommend using the Codific SAMMY and also the OWASP SAMM framework. OWASP SAMM is vendor agnostic, but I would suggest look into OWASP SAMM. It is really great for eliciting the type of culture positive in application security.
Yeah, and actually kind of piggybacking a little bit on that, I'll ask a quick follow-up question, because something we've seen as well in our own experience, kind of talking to a lot of different practitioners that are using OWASP SAMM and companies that are interested in implementing OWASP SAMM, is that when you're dealing with a framework like ISO 27001 or SOC Type 2, these types of compliance frameworks, things are very much yes or no, right? Like there's not really, it's either you're complying or you're not complying. And kind of my question here is, did the maturity levels in OWASP help in that sense? Because it kind of gives you a granular way of going from one level to the next. And it's not that much yes or no, it's more where are you now and where do you want to be in the future? Did that kind of help in your specific case at Signin Solutions?
Yeah, so I'll roll it back a bit. Is that ISO 27001 is information security management baseline. So once you have it, customers see your accredited certification, they believe you have all the necessary functions to effectively have information security management. And I'll talk more on the GRC side of this. And afterwards, in the US and globally, depending where you are, there's a SOC 2 Type 2 attestation. So it's an external report system based on a test period. And I would generalize and oversimplify is that it tests your actual controls based on that time period. So if you pair these two together, that's what we would call sufficient assurance for customers that you have something in place, right? But because we are a cloud SaaS, application security is part of those frameworks, but it appears as a thought after. It's almost like a checklist. Like it is sufficient, but it's not going in depth into change management. It's not listing the requirements of secure hygiene, especially in application security. And then that's why we leverage OWASP SAMM, because it goes deeper into those items. Deeper meaning is actually listing more of the controls and how you could actually function. And what's good about it for us is that OWASP is a premier for us in terms of application security out there, but at the same time, it's listing what's needed by the developer. So, we want to make sure developer hours are very expensive, but we want to make sure they're also are doing something that's interesting. So for us, going towards OWASP SAMM is why we chose that. Is that we're using OWASP Top 10. It seems like, okay, this is what's enough, but how could we make it far more secure for our customers, right? So that's where we end up and landed on.
Okay, no, that makes a lot of sense. So specifically, let's say like the quality criteria in SAM were also very, very interesting because they introduced the controls that you kind of needed to then be able to track the progress towards security over time. That makes a lot of sense. And you're mentioning specifically developers, and actually we've had as well in previous. I remember in the OWASP SAMM user day back in Barcelona in May, there was a bit of a discussion of whether OWASP SAMM is meant for developers or if it's not. I think you have a very interesting take on this based on what we've discussed before. And specifically, I want to ask you, so how did it help? Because I know from our previous conversation that you mentioned it helped specifically in vulnerability management and improving your SDLC, which are obviously very, very focused as well on what the developers are doing. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on that, and whether as well, what's your general opinion of whether OWASP SAMM is a framework that's meant for developers or if it's not?
Yeah, I'll begin with your last one first. You can use almost any type of mindset and framework. You can even, I'm just being bold here, you can even use the mindset of yoga if you wanted creatively to apply to application security. Anything goes, right? But for us, it has to be it has to be tangible and material to our developers. Two, it cannot be seen as a blocker, right? And three, is it something that we can actually gradually scale to? So is OWASP SAMM really the best? Well, it's the best for us. If it's the best for you, I don't know. It would depend on your practice. One of the, I would look at it from a benefits perspective is that, can we do a natural path with application security? Meaning, can we go with our developers rather than seeing, if you're in a highway and we're like 300 kilometers per hour and the developer is at 50 kilometers per hour, can we scale it back or always at that speed? So that's it. That's what we're looking at. Is it a fluid and natural path? Second is we believe that application security, specifically with our SDLC practice anyway, is iterative and behavioral rather than a system shock. Because if you look at it from a system shock, our engineers are always switching into compliance mode, right? We don't want them context switching. We want them developing, right? And the habit of security should just be natural. So some of the things that we're introducing, like vulnerability triages, that is an expectation. But by using OWASP SAMM, we're using questions and live benchmarking that make it gradual and silent. And that's what we want, is that we want it to be a natural flow. On top of that is quality and integrity. So these two things can get very subjective when you're developing. So for us, how do you measure quality? Is it through like subjective questions that OWASP SAMM is eliciting? And through that, are you going towards an objective list that you want to, right? So for terms of quality, getting more a bit technical, is that are you looking at pushing code through your branch trees? Are you looking at pushing code with another developer? And are you communicating with that developer or the other pusher, right? And in your branch trees, are you doing those reviews? Now, these may seem simple and granular, but they are meant to, because if you're in a fast-paced company or in a company that has competing deliverables, some of the items I just mentioned seem like, nah, we'll just slowly take a look away from that. We'll take a break, which is what degrades quality and integrity, right? So a lot of what we're introducing in OWASP SAMM is just basically how we're making it feel natural. And of course, I think one of the bigger ones that Nicholas is interested in here is in how does it affect your cyber insurance readiness and risk management and risk mitigation? It does. Depends on where you are. So we're a cloud SaaS. So for cyber insurance and risk management, is that if you rely, so I also have a legal background, so this maybe it works. I just have multiple hats. It's that for us, how do we diminish the risk that we have as a company and also diminish the risk for our customers? So one thing you can assess how great or how good your working compliance and security program is around cyber insurance readiness, right? Because your cyber insurance provider during renewal and when you're getting one, they look at your entire risk management stack, meaning, do you have, for example, going by GRC, do you have, your ISO, your SOC 2, do you have change management policies and others, disaster recovery, incident response? Do you even have normal vulnerability cadence? They do go deep into that. Second, they'd look at your contractual requirements. So that's a big one. You don't have to be a very sophisticated company, but your contractual requirements do state whether or not you have a compliance security program. Third is, it can go very deep, right? It can go into application security, which is what this podcast is about, is that are you ready in terms of there's bug errors, in terms of issues that were caused through your applications, right? You can take that up to your cyber insurance provider, or you can take that up internally with your legal team or the team that you're working with to assess your cyber insurance. So we use OWASP SAMM as part of that. So it's not like we just had our typical GRC frameworks. We have a couple, and OWASP SAMM is that compensatory layer. Why all of that is being presented to as part of our cyber insurance is because insurance providers, or basically a third party, can look at it. A third party assessing you is going to look at you far more favorably if you've done your very best, right? Not just acting like tick boxes, right? A lot of this they will actually review.
Yeah. Oh no, sorry. Do you have more to say around the insurance topic? So from my understanding as well is that you mentioned that OWASP SAMM specifically allows you to show more explicitly or more also to what extent you've implemented certain security processes in place, that ultimately is what allows you to show insurance companies that you've actually lowered the level of risk of insuring you, which also then translates to more beneficial premiums, let's say. Is that kind of also the case?
Yeah, I would look at risk management as measurable. It could be managed, and it also could be monitored and mitigated. Several ways an approach to it, but those are the basics. With OWASP SAMM, yes, it does. So for us, and this may be what you call an enlightenment, because this is application security, but I'm talking more on the GRC and legal side. Essentially, we present all of these as part of our cyber insurance portfolio. And if you present it to the point, and of course, this is also at the same time you finding a cyber insurance provider or a different type of assessor that understands your technology stack. We present these because it's objective, measurable, and material. That's what OWASP SAMM is as part of our overall risk management. And is it directly contributing to reducing or risk? Yes, of course. But if you're asking us around cyber insurance, present this portfolio or something similar that you have, what we call a pre-assessment with potential cyber insurance providers or even with your legal team, and they'll actually look at whether or not you're reducing risk. Because the more you reduce risk, the more you're favorable for premiums and coverage. It also gets folded into as part of your compliance registry controls. And again, it's coming back to what I said earlier. It's in fluid, natural, and behavioral. Why that's applicable to cyber insurance is for no better other reason is that it will reduce your premium if you're showing a mature process. And mature does not mean you have to have everything perfect. It just shows you have a practice in place that will weather any storm or attempt to, right? Is it durable is basically the question.
Yeah, no, I understand. And actually maybe then a follow-up question would be that how, just to explain a little bit further, how is it that or why, let's say, why couldn't you achieve, let's say, similar results or the same results if you had just had, as you did before, ISO 27001 and SOC Type 2? Like, what really is the add-on that having OWASP SAMM and presenting that as part of your portfolio, let's say, to the assessment agency, to the insurance agency? What is the actual add-on that it gives you over if you just show and you just go on and say like, oh, we're ISO 27001 certified, we're SOC Type 2 certified? What is the actual additional add-on that OWASP SAMM gives you over just that?
Yeah, and there's no right or wrong answer. I mean, it depends on each company's practices, but I would think of this as an onion, right? And an onion has many layers when you peel it. So for us, OWASP SAMM is not the end-all be-all for our application security. It's simply a compensatory control. And the reason I use the onion example is that the way we do security here is we have compensatory controls against the other. So that may seem like complex, but it's not. So when I said ISO, it's complemented by SOC 2. And with that is that our BCP plan is complemented by a specific practice. Our incident response plan is specific and complemented against the RTO, RPO. And then we do have custom and bespoke systems for those. And then OWASP SAMM is more of the holistic approach because it lives through codific. But at the same time, we use it to gauge how the others are functioning. So if you layer them all together, just like an onion, that's how we're approaching and reducing risk. So that's where it benefits. It's actual and natural. It's not one control that could fail. And the other part I do want to bring up in terms of GDPR, and it's very important for this call also, is that being the privacy and data protection officer globally, is we use European GDPR as a security baseline. So part of OWASP SAMM is meeting Article 25 by data protection by design and default, because OWASP SAMM has threat modeling that you could use as part of your developer review session. It also goes to the extent of role-based access control in our APIs for us, and that could be yours. And as part of your review process through OWASP SAMM, you can look at data manifestation in your schemas, right? Another interesting one is Article 5 of GDPR, which is around integrity and confidentiality. So things like having default encryption, transit and rest, secure logging, or even automated alerts for suspicious access patterns. These may seem like something you just should have and should have by default, but a lot of these are being checked through OWASP SAMM. You can say that your other frameworks check it, sure, but at the end of the day, where I'm getting and being towards is that we're running a business just like anyone else, and when you run a business, changes will always happen. And how durable and resilient is your security program, right? It's not like, hypothetically, if you put it that way, did we really need it? No, we could have just stayed with OWASP top 10. We could have just said, we have all these items and controls. We have a plethora of them. But
yeah,
is it sufficient? Because the weather is always changing, right?
Of course. Yeah, it's a concept of defense in depth as well, right? You don't want to be doing either or. You want to be doing both things if possible. Everything you can do that can help to reduce the risk and can help to improve your posture should be would generally be a good idea to do. And taking us a step back as well to the insurance story, I'm curious as well from my own perspective. I have a background in economics, so I'm very much about, return on investments, these sort of things. Because one of the things that really impressed us about this particular story, and you know this, Jason, because we also discussed it in the past, is it's one of the first examples we've seen, really, that where you can attribute direct cost savings, let's say, to the implementation of OWASP SAMM. Now, from this conversation, I understand it was obviously not only the implementation of OWASP SAMM, it was implementation of OWASP SAMM together with a plethora of other frameworks and controls and things in place. But to that question, basically my question would be then, do you think there's definitely a return on investment when it comes to the time you've spent so far implementing OWASP SAMM, carrying out the assessments, seeing where you're at? I know you guys don't develop like long-term improvement plans, but let's say implementing certain improvements based on what you found in OWASP SAMM and how you want to continue to improve your security. So yeah, is there a return on investment on it?
Of course. I mean, at the end of the day, it's you're running a business, so there has to be an ROI, and that ROI is very important to us internally in how we manage our day to day. So the return on investment is, I would look at it from three things. So I'll list three things. The first one is we want to make our developers efficient. We want them to be in a spot where they're contributing secure code, right? But for us to do that, are we going to be an enabler or a blocker, right? So in terms of ROI, efficiency is a key gain for us, right? And second, that leads into, well, what does that mean, right? Well, it means communication and culture and behavioral changes. So those might seem like, well, that should be just part of your job. But again, we're all human, so you have to look at it that way. We all want to communicate. We all have the means to signal to each other. And how do we do it in a way that is, respectful of everyone, eliciting the right type of approaches, and behavioral, meaning not just the human attitude of it, but also in terms of our day-to-day how-tos, right? The third part of it is, in terms of ROI, it allows us to embed security deeper. It's deeper than defense in depth. It's almost like it's just coding or just breathing air or just, getting coffee. We want to make it very seamless and natural, because that's the type of habits you want to proceed with for. And the reason I'm approaching it from that perspective, more from a fluid, natural, and behavioral change, is that I'll try an example. Let's say you work at a physical building, right? And you have fire drills every year. Now it seems like you know what to do if there's a fire, right? And then you have a fire drill for regulations. But what if you do fire drills monthly, but you do it in a way that's not disruptive to the business? You do fire drills during your coffee break, right? You do fire drills while we're getting donuts. Now, it's going to slowly become a practice. It's not a blocker. I wouldn't say it's fun, but is it slowly becoming part of your business duties? And I'm using that example, even though it's not the best one, because it just shows that we're not doing it once a year. We're doing it far more frequent, but at the same time, we want to make it fluid and natural. That's the ROI for us, is that things that you want around risk management, things that you want in cost reduction, that can only be elicited if you're keeping a cohesive and flexible and healthy culture. And that culture starts with communication. And OWASP SAMM, if you look at it from a different perspective, it's a communication tool, right? You can look at it as not like, when I saw it, it's like, yeah, perfect. If it's for application security, it's a go. Let's get it done. We're also doing a GRC function. But to me, it's, how do I communicate with our developers? How do I communicate with our leadership or the rest of the business? And how do we also, for our internal and for our external, meaning our customers, how do we portray ourselves as a responsible organization? And then for that, I would roll it back to our onion layer example. It's that we have multiple layers. They're all compensatory. The whole purpose of that is we are a durable and resilient company. And for us to do that, we've introduced OWASP SAMM.
No, yeah, that sounds, it's super interesting as well, the idea of OWASP SAMM as a communication tool and something that really helps to drive security practices at the end of the day, right? Slowly and maturely implement these practices and build habits, build those security habits, which I think it's also the matter of if you look at security as a checklist, right? If you approach security as a checklist of things you need to do, it will always be treated that way, right? If it's just a matter of ticking off, oh, did we run the SAS scan? Did we run the DAS scan? Did we do a pen test? Did we do X, Y, Z? And you always treat it as a checklist. It will always be treated that way, and it's hard to really get that buy-in, right, from the organization and from everyone within the organization that it's something necessary and that it's something that you want to be doing. And I think the way you are approaching it, the way while implementing OWASP SAMM is very interesting in really just slowly and maturely building those habits, implementing those practices. And actually, maybe could you just elaborate a little bit then on what's the day-to-day like in that sense? So just so people understand what your day-to-day of how you approach implementing security within the organization. I understand also from previous conversations that you do have, I think it was weekly, if I'm not mistaken, meetups with the developers, and where you're kind of having a conversation with them and evaluating together what certain things you could start to improve upon. Can you maybe just walk us through a little bit what the day-to-day looks like and how OWASP SAMM helps in that?
Yeah, sorry, it looks like I was on mute. Yeah, so I just pulled up the OWASP SAMM framework, so it's better for me to describe what it is, right? So let's look at it from a weekly basis. From a weekly basis, you're of course getting your OWASP SAMM. You have your strategy and metrics, right? You have your policy and compliance and education and guidance. So that is your starting point, is how I would look at it and how you would approach this. Meaning,
I actually share my screen real fast here. And we
can
just pull up
make it more visual.
Yeah, okay. I'll just pull up the whole model here.
Yeah, okay. Perfect. And if we can expand that so others can see also.
Yeah, I'll just zoom in a little bit.
Yeah, so if I was just to look at this and don't think the tiles are daunting, the whole purpose is to organize you, and it will allow you, if you're not familiar with it, and if you're very super familiar, it will allow you to basically scale depending on your needs. So if I look at it from a weekly basis, and it's going to sound like a lot of information, but it can be, but it's perhaps just how my mind thinks, how we approach it, is that if you're in a team, you're in a spot, you're the cybersecurity manager, or you're in a different function, you're a GRC, from a weekly perspective, the first thing you would pull up is what we would pull up is how are you governing, right? What metrics are you going to be measuring? And are those metrics towards your business requirements, right? And part of those metrics feed in or come from your strategy. Like, what is your strategy? For us, I've told you what ours is. We use OWASP SAMM as a compensatory control. And then in terms of policy and compliance, is it meeting your obligations, your internal controls, right? And it should, because otherwise you shouldn't be doing it, And in terms of education and guidance, is your approach educational? Is it guiding the team, right? Now, that may seem simple, but are your vulnerability triages educational? Is it eliciting the type of communication feedback that could weed out the types of vulnerabilities that may have been overlooked? And is it effective against your culture? Now, that is how you look at it first. Now, if you look at the next side, is it meaning the design? One of the key things we introduce is access reviews. It might seem like we're already doing that, though, but are we doing it on a weekly cadence? Because for us, we do. In terms of threat assessment, access reviews have that. And how that feeds into application security is we always look at our configuration and accesses. And in terms of our vulnerability triages, it's not meant to as a, hey, these are the potential vulnerabilities and false positives. Developers, could you please look at that? No, it's the way we approach it more is almost philosophical, or maybe that's a bigger word, but we bring vulnerabilities. We ask our developers, what do you think of this? Rather than what I've seen before, even in prior companies, well, we have a list of vulnerabilities. Is it really your fault? So we're taking away kind of like the blame factor and making it much more culture, like, hey, we saw this, we believe it's a false positive, what do you think, right? And then in terms of security requirements, are these vulnerabilities in the design actually vulnerabilities, or is there something around features that we should be looking at, right? The next thing you would look at is secure architecture. So we work closely with our DevOps team, and some of those architecture is, we have now also started bi-weekly looking at architecture diagrams. And that might seem like that's a lot of work, but it isn't, because you have to look at it from a bird's eye view. You started with your governance, your set of policies, procedures, and metrics. Now you're moving to design. You're looking at how you're assessing it. And in what I just mentioned briefly is, how is your culture around with your developers? And the reason I mentioned DevOps, even if you may or may not have DevOps team, which is developer operations, is you should still be looking at your architecture diagram. Because at this stage, you should be working with your product team and understanding what features are being built, how the product is working. And then you look at implementation. So again, this may all seem daunting, but we use Codific SAMMY for this just to check what we have. Is your build secure? Meaning, do you have the necessary checks and functions? Are you deploying? You should at least have staging environment. You should at least have a quality assurance. And if not, then you can take a look at whether you have gaps. So I'm on stage 3, I'm on implementation, and throughout the entire process I mentioned to you, you could use that to ask yourself, do you have gaps, right? And in terms of defect management, no software is going to be perfect. So if you hear someone say that, it's a red flag. But defect management is just tracking whether those could be on the list or how we're measuring the metrics. And that part alone is key if you don't have a big quality assurance team, or if you don't have a team that's dedicated to fixing vulnerabilities or bug issues, right? Meaning, how are you going to weave that in now with your team's daily duties? You could be a small startup. One of the habits is just organizing yourselves, and that's part of why we look at OWASP SAMM. It's how do you organize yourself and communicate? Because sometimes some of these, what I call a conversation, can get difficult depending on what it is. As I said, things change in the business quickly, but you can use OWASP SAMM as your guiding path. And when you're looking at your verification, again, it's almost like architecture assessment. We did just describe that in design and secure architecture, right? But it can go deeper into validating, mitigating. And you don't necessarily, I wouldn't say you don't need a secure architect, but if you're just starting, these would help you guide towards the path of bigger roles that your company will have in the future, right? So you're actually doing your secure architecture review, you're doing your security diagrams, you're even working with legal at this stage if you have one, because basically the OSM function is a framework that is legally defensible. It also is a framework that is also managing your risk, right? You can look at requirements-driven testing. So when I'm just looking at this, it sounds like it's more technical. It isn't. And again, I'm doing this from an overhead high-level overview. Are you actually doing requirements-driven testing? And it's not part of your communication cadence, right? And security testing in verification, it's almost like you've done it in the earlier stages, right? It's as if you've already been doing it. But even in our onion layer approach, you can see here that every single tile is checking one or the other. And it's dependent on how you're approaching it based on your organization and needs. So it is very flexible. It's designed to because it will scale according to who you are and what you all are doing. And in terms of operations, this is more to me like, do you have the ability to manage incidents? So typically, you have a backup playbook, you have a disaster recovery playbook, and you have an incident response. But are you testing that? So that's a really good question, and that relays back to your cyber resilience and readiness. But something that cyber insurance providers or even your customers who are who have a deeper security team or bigger one would look at that. It's like, is it actually effective, or is it just a policy there? And if something does happen, is it just an all hands approach? And then also in terms of environment management, which I mentioned earlier, because you're doing secure architecture and design, and you're also looking at that through the other tiles, is you're just basically doing a good habit of configuration hardening. And the last one is around operational management, meaning, are you handling your version if you have ones that are outdated? And it's totally fine, right, as long as they're not criticals. But are you managing your versions and uplifting to the new one properly, or is that something feasible for you? But you have to understand that as part of your application security. And then the last part of this is around data protection. Just keep in mind, our company is also in Europe. So for us, data protection is not just a checklist against the articles of GDPR. I have a background in privacy engineering also. So what that means for us is how we operationalize the GDPR articles. Now, this may seem a lot, but that's the whole point of why we're using OWASP SAMM, is that there are multiple practices, field, skills, and talents that I've just described that we handle all through OWASP SAMM as a compensatory layer. So it's almost you're seeing how our operations work with our other existing. But that's the whole point of this, is that if you're starting new, you can actually move up slowly. But if you have a bigger, more complex organization, it allows you to see where your gaps are. It allows you to see your actual internal threat landscape against the external. And you can only do that if you have something that organizes into tiles or building blocks or into movable blocks as part of your application security model.
Sounds super interesting. I was gonna ask now if you had any advice for people using SAM, but I think you've already dropped a trillion dimes right here with everything you've mentioned and going into different areas. And yeah, I 100% agree with you in the fact that SAM is it's actually kind of meant for anyone. Even if you're a small startup, we use it, and we're definitely not a big company. And we know, and we have clients of companies that are, you know, tens of thousands of employees across multiple business units, and they are also using SAM and implementing it and improving upon it every single day. So I think it's super flexible in that sense, and I like your approach of also using it on a bird's eye view. I guess you go more in depth or less in depth as well into specific practices depending on what your priority is, right, with improving. Because one of the things is that you cannot always improve everything at once. You usually have to focus on one thing and then move towards another. In your case, obviously, if you're working with multiple teams, you can be improving multiple things at a time, but it's generally you still need a certain level of focus. Um, Before we move on to the last question, I also thought of something that I think would be very interesting to ask to you, because you clearly have also a lot of experience using the framework and understanding of the practical implementation of it. If you could pitch, let's say, I don't know if pitch is the right word, but recommend the OWASP SAM core team, right? Something that they should maybe look into considering, look to add for SAM version 3. What would it be? Like, what do you think it might be missing? Like, what would be something or something you would like to change? Like maybe something that's unnecessary. What do you think would be a nice addition or nice change for version 3?
If you're talking about the OSM program itself, I mean, it's to be honest, I love it. I'm a huge fan of it. We breed it daily and how we do things. Essentially, for version 3.0, I would add a bit more questions than what they have, right? And there's a reason for that. And again, I'm going to give two good reasons. You don't know what you don't know. So it doesn't matter how great your security team is, or your application developers, or your size just starting. You don't know what you don't know. And these questions are not meant to just measure. They're meant to keep you honest. So the more questions you have, the easier it is to implement these, because they're creating the type of environment when you listen and ask yourself those type of questions. Do I actually have it? Or if I'm a bigger organization, yeah, I know I don't have it, but how do I present to my executives the gaps? So my tip for version 3.0 for OWASP is just add a little bit more questions here and there where you can, just so the user itself can expand and use this. Because eventually, at the end of the day, OWASP SAM, if I was to oversimplify this, and if we live in a paper and pen world, this is my question list. And is this question list towards the business, right? So just adding a bit more questions would help. Now, questions can be dangerous because now you're going into a rabbit hole, but it's not. Just add a couple more in there, perhaps the same thing, because the framework's pulled up here. A question in secure architecture could be similar or in parallel to a question in security testing and verification. And that's the whole design of it, right? I'm going back to the onion layer approach again of OWASP SAM. But to improve it, just add a couple more questions. That may seem simple, but it's not to whomever is building this. The question has an implication, but is that implication positive or flexible towards the other tiles or framework itself? But towards OWASP SAM as on its own, it's having that is better than not having it. Even OWASP Top 10, it helped generalize what is application security, right? It's a lot because to the normal person or to those who don't really understand it, it may seem like developers are, they have a zipped up hoodie hiding in a dark room and they're doing this magical unicorn work. But this puts a human factor to it. It's like, oh, this is actually something we can measure. It's something that could be absorbed by any teams and easily understood.
Yeah, so your idea with that, let's say, is that if you add a couple more questions, there's more room, let's say, for discussions and conversations, which ultimately what you mentioned, OWASP SAM is a very powerful communication tool, right? So if you add just even one more question, that could already provoke a new thought or a new conversation within an organization on maybe a security process or a security like a specific area that they hadn't thought of before. following what you're saying, right? You don't know what you don't know. I think, yeah, that could be definitely very, very interesting. And do you have any final like CTA or word of advice or something that you just like to elaborate for the audience? It can be for anyone really.
Yeah, I think final CTA for me, key takeaway is that use this to complement what you have, not to replace what you have, right? You must be confident in what you do in your role, and this is to help you, improve or just help you check what things you're doing. In terms of those who are in application security, think of this as compensatory control for the GRC or those legal team. This is an amazing framework to gauge your cyber resilience and maturity. And in general, just key takeaway, the whole intent of this is not to create work for you. It's actually to reduce it and make it organized. And to my point earlier that Nicholas has mentioned here, is this is a communication tool. How are you communicating? And that's what I would leave to those listeners when looking at OSM and Kudovic's OSM.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Jason, for your time here today. I really appreciate you having taken the time to join us today, this podcast, and hopefully we can definitely collaborate on something else on the future if anything comes out. Well, we'll also wait for SAM version 3 as well to get your feedback on that whenever it comes out. But yeah, thank you.
Sounds great. Thank you, Nicholas.